In the meantime, I want to talk about the big political row that is happening. The Daily Mail front page this morning: Starmer must break his silence on the trans judgment. Campaigners and MPs demanding the Prime Minister backs the ruling after saying nothing for 5 days. I mean, in fairness to the Prime Minister, he has been on holiday. And I don't know about you, there's some people who say politicians should work all the time and they should always be on call, they should never sleep, they should live in a cave and eat grass. And frankly, I think politicians need to have rest. I think they need to have holidays. I want them to have 8 hours sleep a night. I want them to be rested and refreshed and ready and focused. We had a workaholic Prime Minister in Rishi Sunak. Look how that worked out. Keir Starmer's on holiday. Yes, he should say something about the trans debate. He should probably say so today. He's back. I think he's probably not going to say anything until Wednesday. I think this pressure is going to continue. But let's find out what Helen Joyce thinks. She's Director of Advocacy at Sex Matters and author of Transgender Identity and the New Battle for Women's Rights. Helen, thank you for joining me this morning. What a dramatic and busy few days it has been for you, no doubt. Where are we with this now? There's so many things I want to ask you about. I want to ask you about the MPs who aren't happy about this, but specifically on Starmer, what would you like him to say?
I'd like him to do what he did with the Cass review, which is to have the government state its position strongly and clearly, which is that it fully accepts it, fully supports it, and will fully implement it. The Supreme Court ruling isn't a change in the law, it's an explanation of what the law has always been, and people have wildly misunderstood the law, including the government lawyers, government departments, the regulator, all sorts of people. Now the Supreme Court ruling is the last word on what the law actually is, and what it says is that the terms sex, man and woman in the Equality Act mean biological sex, nothing to do with identity, nothing to do with paperwork. That's going to require a lot of policies to change, government policies, but also industry policies, things in sports clubs or sporting competitions or swimming pools or schools, all these things. It's going to take time to cascade. So what's needed is a clear and unambiguous statement as soon as possible saying we will do this work. We will make sure that everything comes into compliance with the law and we accept that that is the law.
If I was Kemi Badenoch on Wednesday, I would honestly do this. If I was advising her, I would stand up and say, can the Prime Minister tell the House what he thinks a woman is? That's what I would do. You don't even need to say, does he agree with the Supreme Court? And clearly there are some MPs who don't. The Mail on Sunday reporting yesterday that even a culture minister, Sir Chris Bryant, doesn't seem to be happy with what the chairwoman of the Equality and Human Rights Commission has said on this. I mean, they are the organisation that has to show clarity on this, that has to give advice to businesses, to organisations, to public sector organisations. And I think when Baroness Faulkner went on the radio on Thursday, she was actually just doing her job and giving some of that clarity, which will come. But people are still adjusting to this, Helen, aren't they?
They're adjusting, but also the backlash is starting. The people who don't want this to be the law, who thought for the last 15 years that they could sneak in gender self-ID under cover of the existence of the gender recognition certificate, which, let's remember, only about 9,000 people in the country have, and which certainly don't change your sex in reality and don't change your sex even for all laws. But yes, those people thought that they had it all done and dusted, that they had snuck in gender self-ID by the back door, and now they're waking up belatedly to the fact that nobody wanted it. It never happened democratically. It never happened in law. The Supreme Court has spoken, and they're trying to cause confusion. They're trying to spread misinformation. I mean, just today I saw an article in the Times in which a trans woman said, why is the government bringing forward legislation about this? The government didn't bring forward legislation. Yeah. A Supreme Court ruling is not government legislation. Yeah. So everybody in authority needs to be super, super clear, like just really precise and concise. The Supreme Court has spoken. This is the law, This is what it means, now all policies must come into compliance and we will do the necessary work for that.
In terms of that though, in terms of legislation, do you think the government would try, I mean it's such a politically toxic issue, as you know far better than I do, Helen, you live it, but in terms of a government bringing legislation to overturn the Supreme Court or to change things in the law, do you think they'll actually do that?
I cannot imagine it. I mean, to say that it's toxic is to understate the matter. I mean, over the weekend we saw protests in which enraged and entitled men turned up with banners in Parliament Square, and they defaced a statue of Millicent Fawcett, the only woman in Parliament Square who was, of course, very important to women's rights campaigners. They held banners saying the only good turf is a dead turf. They peed. They had a dirty protest in effect. I don't understand why men think that they can persuade women that they belong in men's toilets by peeing.
I don't think anyone would have done this, but if there'd been anyone who supported your cause, who'd held up a banner saying the only good trans person is a dead trans person, the police would have rightly swooped in on that person and arrested them. And I wonder why that person who held that sign, who, we've seen their photograph. I hope the police take action on this. And also, I also believe, Helen, and I wonder what you think about this, had the Supreme Court decision gone the other way, there would have been loads of people who said, well, Helen Joyce and her ilk, it's the rule of law. The Supreme Court has spoken. You've got to follow this. Why don't these trans activists, not all of them, but some of them, why don't they just accept the rule of law in this country?
Because that's not what it was ever about for them. It was about being entitled. It was about, forcing women to comply with their totally unreasonable demands. And, if the law allowed them to do that, they'd use the law. If the law tries to stop them, we've seen many signs in many cities over the weekend saying, you can't stop me. I will still come into your toilets. It doesn't matter what the law says. If you stand in my way, you will feel my wrath type thing. So that's why the government really, really needs to be super clear on this. And it needs to direct all the other agencies of the state, from the police to the regulators, to schools, to hospitals, to step into line as quickly as it is humanly possible. I accept that it's the Easter holidays, so I really do understand why people haven't made statements over this weekend. Today's a bank holiday, tomorrow's not. We're back to work tomorrow. It's time that everybody who has any position of authority, who has any policy that says anything about men being entitled to come into women's spaces, if they identify as women or if they have pieces of paper saying they are women, that those policies no longer hold and that work is proceeding at pace to change them, to bring them into line with the law.
So being in line with the law, Helen, how do you think things will actually change on a practical level? Will we see restaurants saying to trans people, no, you must go to the toilet that is of your birth sex, for example? Will we see it on a day-to-day basis? Because I was speaking to a number of people yesterday, including women who had seen men dressed as women in their toilets in restaurants, for example, or out and about, and felt very, very intimidated by that. There was no intimidatory behaviour other than their presence, but their very presence, as was indicated by those calls, was intimidating those women. And a woman talking about her elderly mother, for example, feeling very, very uncomfortable in that toilet.
Basically, what has to happen is that the signs male and female now mean in law male and female. As Kishore Faulkner has said in her radio interview, if you put up a sign that says female, that means it's only for female. If you allow in even one man, any special man, any man who identifies as a woman, it's become a mixed sex space. And in law, you can't treat female-only spaces as if they're mixed sex. They're two different things. So the people who say, oh, well, you can still set your own policy. Well, you can, but then we'll challenge you in court and we'll win. That's what the judgment means. So I think it's going to take time for people to understand that whatever about where a man who identifies as a woman goes, the first point is he can't go into the ladies. He can go into the men's if he feels comfortable there, or if there's no other option, or if there's a unisex third option, which I think we're going to have more of, because so many of these men have been given such a sense of entitlement that, they feel they can't go into the men's. We may have to accommodate them that way. But anyway, the first point is just that if it says the woman sign, F, female, or any of those words, no men can come in. The point is to set the clear rule first and then to think about enforcement afterwards. It's not the case that we can say some men won't do what they're told, therefore we can't have the rule. No, we set the rule and then we work out how to enforce it.
Also on my show yesterday, Helen, I spoke to a disabled person who was very worried that lots of trans people are just going to use the disabled toilets, and often people with disabilities need to use the toilet quite quickly. Is that a concern of yours, Helen?
Yes, that does worry me, because we haven't been set up for thinking about people who, in quite large numbers, I mean, it's still not very large numbers, but quite large numbers, are really determined not to go into the space where they actually belong. So I think we're going to have to see how it plays out. I mean, I think a lot of places can actually add an extra gender-neutral single-user toilet. There is space.
Yeah.
But I mean, the primary point is this is a problem for men to solve. If men aren't comfortable in men's spaces, then it's men's job to make sure those men are comfortable. We women have been told for so long that we need to be kind and inclusive, that we need to accept the odd men who are dressed as women in our spaces. Now the messaging needs to turn to men. Men need to be told if a man comes in a skirt, maybe he's got a wig, maybe you think like that's a very odd looking man. It's your job not to make him feel uncomfortable, because this is where he belongs.
Helen, thank you. That's Helen Joyce there, Director of Advocacy at Sex Matters and author of Trans, Gender Identity and the New Battle for Women's Rights.